Thank you. It is very nice to be here. Thank you so much for coming out today. Really, really happy to be here. How's everyone doing so far? Good? Good. So Sebastian was so kind as to introduce me with so much detail. The beginning of my presentation here is probably unnecessary, so I'm going to just click through it real fast. As he mentioned, these are the companies that First Round has been fortunate enough to invest in. And the one thing that I'll emphasize about that is that we are called First Round for a very good reason. We like to invest in companies at the very earliest point in their lifetimes. So for many of these companies, we actually just met the founders when they were just a small team with an idea. So it's been really excellent to see a lot of them grow into the major powerhouses that they are today. Let's see. He also mentioned my job really focuses at First Round on publishing the First Round Review, which is very much so focused on interviewing people who are giants in the tech space and understanding from a very tactical perspective how it is that they got to where they are today. So for example, this is the CEO of Reddit, and we were lucky enough to feature him. Worked at Tesla, the Wall Street Journal, so I have a lot of empathy for a lot of the decisions that all of you in this room make every day about coverage and deciding exactly what it is that you feel is important to communicate to the public. So there are 4 areas that I'd love to cover today. The first is that there are changes in the audience that is interested in learning about technology and startups. And just as a caveat here, I will be speaking from the perspective of what's going on in the US, but I really feel pretty strongly that there are strong parallels between what is going on in Silicon Valley and San Francisco and what is happening here and in other tech ecosystems around the world. So I will talk about changes that I've been seeing happening in the audience for technology-driven news and people who are interested in startups. I will also cover new ways to find these stories and to surface what is interesting. I think that there are a few new opportunities for finding great stories to tell about startups. 3, determining what to cover. As you probably know all too well, it's extremely noisy covering startups. There are many, many companies launching with venture capital funding every day. So figuring out which ones are actually worthy of your time and resources to cover. I have some ideas around that. And then lastly, the types of stories that audiences tend to be very interested in and what's getting traction and what type of stories are going viral that I've seen sort of firsthand. So hopefully I'll be able to cover all of that, starting with how the audience for startup stories is changing. My major point here is that there is a tremendous amount of popular mass market interest in startup stories these days. It's almost rivaling Hollywood and media in terms of how much interest there is from just the general population. And a lot of this has been accelerated by apps taking off and being in the limelight like Instagram, like Snapchat. And those are definitely as popular here, if not more so than they are in the US. So you have a lot of people who are paying attention to what the hottest new thing is in tech. And the hottest new thing tends to travel very fast and to change all of the time. One of my colleagues sent me this graph recently that ComScore put together showing what the most popular apps per age demographic were, and I was really shocked and disappointed in myself that I did not recognize even the names of the apps for the age group right below me, and then also for the age group right above me. I did not know what iFunny was. I did not know what Checkout 51 was. And it really occurred to me that things are moving so fast and that there is so much popular interest in what's going on with new apps, new companies, that I even wasn't keeping up with it, even though it's pretty much my job too. So this trend, and I'll explain this image in a minute, the trend is not only for consumer-based companies, this is also influencing the way that enterprise or company-facing companies are also needing to behave. They also are needing to tell stories that are going to have mass or popular appeal. And the reason for this is that the people who end up making buying decisions inside companies are really just people too. And a lot of them don't read trade publications only. A lot of them don't read trade publications at all. They're mostly turning to the same mainstream media sources in order to make decisions in their professional lives, their personal lives. So it's suddenly more important than ever for enterprise startups to be able to get into these popular publications and mass media sources. So for example, this is art that was created by one of our companies called Flexport that we invest in at First Round. And they are the most B2B company you could possibly imagine. They make it easier for supply chain managers at major freight shippers to figure out where their supply should go. So there's about 500 people that actually qualify to be their customers in the US, basically. But even they have really tried hard in order to produce really popular material. They're writing a ton just internally, their CEO, about how shipping sort of influences the world economy and what the implications are for everyday consumers. And their thinking there is, okay, well, if somebody reads this story and is really interested in it, maybe they're the cousin of one of these people who is a major supply chain manager, and they'll forward the email to them, and maybe that person will make a buying decision. And they've actually been able to generate a lot of leads with this strategy. Another one of our companies that's done something similar is called Instrumental. And they also are extremely B2B. They optimize manufacturing lines for companies like Foxconn, which build, like MacBooks in China. They make their manufacturing lines better. But even they have found value in creating sort of popular audience stories. For example, the CEO wrote this piece about what was really going on with the Samsung phones that were catching on fire. And that story that she wrote ended up going viral and being reprinted in a number of other places and got thousands and thousands of views. And they generated a lot of leads. So for both consumer-facing startups and enterprise-facing startups, being able to tell these stories that have mass appeal for all consumers is becoming really, really important. This also extends to not just individual companies that are being covered, but there's a lot of mass market interest in trends that are going on with technology, particularly what's going on with autonomous vehicles, what's going on with artificial intelligence, with conversational commerce. And not only that, but how are all of the markets adjacent to these tech trends going to be impacted? So if you think about autonomous, there's a bunch of stuff that is going to change or impact or influence, like how older people might be getting around in 10 years. What is in-car entertainment going to look like? Is bars and alcohol, is that going to be different because people aren't going to need to worry about driving after drinking? Like, there's a bunch of stuff that is going to change because of autonomous, and there's a lot of popular interest and appeal of those stories. So that's how the audience is changing. I now want to talk about how that has sort of spurred new channels for how you can find stories that are interesting to tell. But before I get into that, I kind of want to touch on the new pressures and challenges that startups themselves are facing when it comes to getting coverage. Being a startup founder can be tremendously scary. About 75% of new businesses fail, according to the Harvard Business Review. And this has made it really hard for startups because they are sort of launching into the world, and there's no really guarantee. In fact, people assume their failure most of the time. And for this reason, journalists are really changing the way that they are, I would say, interacting with or expressing interest in startups. The space is so noisy, especially in the US. We have dozens of companies launch every single week with venture funding, and a lot of them will go on to fail. And because of this, the press, at least in the US, has sort of turned away from covering individual funding announcements or individual feature announcements or company launches. That's just not something that happens that often anymore. Instead, many of them are really focused on covering what we call the unicorn companies, which tend to be like Airbnb, Slack, Dropbox, those that have had some displayed success. And then, of course, also covering the giants like Google, Amazon, Apple. In fact, a lot of publications have reporters who are solely dedicated to covering those companies. But this really leaves a lot of the smaller startups in the dust and makes it very hard for them to get any attention from the press at all. And if they try to hire or enlist PR to help them in this effort, they are often just throwing a ton of money into a well and getting nothing out of it. A lot of startups cannot pay the $10,000 to $20,000 retainer fee that a lot of PR firms demand. Some of them do pay it and then get nothing out of it, so it's a pretty scary prospect. And also, because of all of this, many founders are deciding just to do PR themselves and to go directly to reporters. They're the ones that are pitching, they're setting up interviews, they're doing the whole thing, which takes them away from running the day-to-day operations of their companies. So that's not great either. So the ones that we have seen be very successful, instead of going out there and saying like, oh, we're launching our company, or hey, we got funding from these investors, they're the ones that have been able to connect what they're doing to larger trends or conversations going on in the industry. The best example of that is a company that we had that recently launched called Modern Fertility. And it makes it easier and cheaper for women to get the data they need about their personal fertility earlier in their lives. But the reason that I think their launch was so successful is that they went out to the press and said, hey, we are 2 women founders. One of us worked at Uber. Who are now creating this company for women consumers. And given how much talk there is in Silicon Valley right now about sexism, sexual harassment, how hard it is to be a woman founder, they pretty much launched at exactly the right time with that particular angle. So they really were very thoughtful about how to connect what they were doing, and their company's launched to something broader. So with that, those are all the challenges that startups are facing when it comes to getting press. And it's an unfortunate struggle for many of them, but for journalists, I actually think it's created some really interesting opportunities for how to find more interesting stories. There are a few new channels where you can figure out what might be worthy of coverage or get some more ideas. The first one of these channels are VC partners and VC firms themselves. So many more of us are engaged in helping our companies get into the press, connect with the right reporters. There are whole teams that have been built inside many venture capital firms just to support the investments after we've made them. These teams are often called platform teams. They do all kinds of things. We help our companies recruit great talent. We throw events. We help connect them with mentors. My job on the platform team, in addition to running the review, is also to help our companies figure out how to talk about themselves to the media and which reporters they should be meeting and making sure those connections get made. So this means that VCs are really primed to be a resource for journalists. Like, we want to talk to you. We want to tell you about the companies that we find interesting, or the trends that we're seeing and what we're funding, or even what we see failing out there. We really want to have those relationships. And I do feel that that relationship in the past between VCs and the press has not always been the strongest. It's usually been very dependent on reporters going to VCs and saying, hey, I want specific information about this news story that I'm working on. And a lot of the times VCs don't want to speak on the record. There's stuff that they don't want to share. I think that there is potential for a much stronger, healthier relationship where we just share what each other is working on. So one tactical recommendation I might make is to figure out who are the VC partners who are focused on investing in your areas of particular interest or coverage. Make a list of them. proactively invite them to go to coffee, set a calendar reminder to get back in touch with them maybe on a quarterly basis. And a lot of these VC partners, the designated members on VC teams, are going to be thrilled to talk to you about what it is that they're seeing that's so interesting. And I think that that could be the source of a lot of story ideas. The second channel that I think is relatively new are founder posts. Because getting PR and press has become so challenging for many startups, a lot of them are just going directly to their consumer base and to their customers by writing posts themselves. You see a lot of founders who are posting directly on Medium, posting on LinkedIn, running sponsored posts in publications like Inc. magazine or Quartz. A lot of them are not writing advertorial content either. They are writing stuff that is of general interest to their industry. They're not necessarily pushing their product. These are stories that could be reported, or that these particular founders would be super thrilled to work with a journalist to somehow report more directly. So definitely would recommend keeping tabs on the founders who are writing in your particular areas of interest and reaching out to them and maybe asking what they have coming down the line. And then lastly, I would say that pre-launch founders are also a very interesting channel of information. Historically, I know that when companies are in stealth, journalists have been kind of hands-off, like, oh, there's nothing to report there. However, I think most of these founders would be extremely interested in forming really strong relationships with reporters prior to launch, so that when they are ready to launch, they actually have those relationships they can draw on. And I think that these founders can be very, very interesting sources of information. They can be experts. They can answer your questions that you have about particular new spaces of technology. Like, for example, we work with a company that is working in autonomous, and those founders really wanted to have good journalist relationships, but didn't know how to do it without letting the cat out of the bag about what it was that they were working on. We helped connect them with a few journalists that we know and trust, and they've become sort of expert sources on just autonomous in general. Whenever those journalists have questions about what's going on with something in particular, or what does a technical term mean, or is this news story legitimate, they're able to go to those founders and ask. And it has been a very mutually beneficial relationship. These two stories actually emerged because of the relationship built between that company and journalists, despite the fact that they had not launched yet. And I'm really excited when this company does launch, they will have all of these warm and friendly connections with journalists as a result. So would highly recommend that when you do connect with venture capitalists, say, hey, I'm really interested in knowing who your stealth founders are as well. You can trust me that I'm not going to report too early on what it is that they're up to, but I would really love to connect with those folks. Picking the best startups to cover. So this is an area where I know a lot of you are probably determining, like, hey, there's a bunch of startups that are emerging in the space. Obviously, we can't cover all of them. Which ones are actually going to be important or influential in the future? There's a number of criteria that I've found to be helpful. Of course, they're not hard or fast rules. But if you are moving fast, which I know many people in this room are, making decisions very fast about what to cover, it could be helpful. So I'll just run through those quickly. The first is the associated investors on a particular deal. If you see funding news, if you see a company launch, who are the investors that are involved? As you probably all just sort of inherently know, there are investors who are more prestigious than others. There's investors that have a better track record than others or seem to be better at diligence. So which ones are attached to the deal? That can be a really interesting and helpful leading indicator about whether a company is worth covering. Founders' former lives, serial entrepreneurs, and second-time founders are actually much more successful, generally speaking, because they know what it's like to run a company. They can fast forward through all of the stuff that really stymies first-time founders. The same goes for people who were product managers at large companies like Google or Facebook. They were essentially the CEOs of their particular divisions of those massive companies. If they go on to found something, that is a company to watch. So keeping tabs on these folks can be extremely helpful. 3 trend indicators and detractors. When companies launch, do they somehow connect to a major trend that you're seeing emerge or already seeing in progress? Do they somehow add to the argument that that trend is either happening? Do they add to the argument that that trend is not happening? So thinking about that, whether or not a company is worth covering. And then compelling positioning. And this is one that I've found to be very helpful. Positioning is a word that we use at First Round to refer to how the company sort of has created mind share for itself in the minds of its customers. How does it describe its value proposition? How does it differentiate itself from other players in the market? And there's a formula that we've shared with them that helps them kind of determine and express what their value proposition is and what their differentiator is. And this is the formula. This is not mine. This comes from like positioning and marketing wisdom from like literally back in the 1960s, and then I learned it from an incredible marketer from Google. It's easier to kind of parse as an example. And the example that I will share of this is for Amazon, and you can kind of tell that this is Amazon's earliest positioning statement because of the words that they've chosen to use. But for World Wide Web users who enjoy books, Amazon is a retail bookseller that offers instant access to 1.1 million books. That's the value proposition. And then unlike traditional booksellers, Amazon is convenient and low priced, and that's the differentiator. So my argument is that if you are determining whether you should cover a startup, why not sketch out this particular positioning statement very quickly for that particular company, and then think to yourself, does it have that compelling of a value proposition? Is it differentiated enough from what other people are doing in this particular market or area? It can be a helpful exercise for just determining really fast whether this story is likely to have mass or popular appeal. Other criteria that I would look at is, and number 5 and 6 are kind of related and coupled, but there are so many startups out there that are learning from what prior startups and what prior companies did in order to be successful, that you're almost seeing this formula of what it's like to build a company emerge. You know, you raise your seed series, you start trying to find product market fit, you raise your Series A, you collect more data, you enter growth. It's become very almost systematic how companies are built and grow. I would look for the companies that are kind of departing from that formula. Are they building themselves in a distinctly different way? Those are companies that are going to be worth covering. And then number 7, is it indicative of a future step change? And by step change, I mean paradigm shift in how the technology works. And we haven't really seen a major step function change in technology since mobile became as pervasive as it is. The blockchain, which I know John spoke about yesterday, could be a potential step change function. We're not sure. We have to still see how it goes. But if you see companies launch that are suggestive of one of these major shifts in how we are going to use technology or communicate as human beings, that's definitely worth covering as well. And then the last section of my talk is about the types of stories that I've seen perform very well for this sort of larger mass market audience. And this is from my perspective as a writer. This is what I've learned putting out the First Round review to this audience of 500,000 people every month. It's also what I've learned from seeing our various startups fare in the media in different ways. So I'll just run through 5 different types of stories that are definitely leaning towards more virality and that more and more readers seem to be interested in. The first are trend stories, which I've already mentioned. The cool thing about trend stories is I think that it would allow the press to continue to report on individual company launches or funding announcements, only combining those in ways that say something broader about what's going on in the industry. So for example, if you see a number of companies launch in one particular area of fintech, what does that say? What kind of story can you write about that? There's going to be a lot of interest in people who want those insights. The second type of story is profiles. We all see stories written, 30 under 30, 40 under 40, people to watch. Every so often, a major magazine will put a founder of a startup on the cover of their magazine, but this is not really open to very early stage founders who also have really remarkable, interesting stories. One of our founders comes to mind for me. His name is Adam Pisoni, and he is a second-time founder. Before that, he was the founder of a company called Yammer that then got sold to Microsoft, and now he is building software that is going to fundamentally change how the public school system works in the US. It is a remarkable story. I think that there would be a lot of interest in it from just a general population of readers, and yet those types of stories are not really being told. This is even more important for featuring founders who are women or underrepresented minorities. This is a huge theme in the industry right now, that there is not enough exposure, not enough elevation for those particular founders. So whenever stories do get written about them, there is tons of popular interest. And it also helps make the entire tech ecosystem stronger. There is a very, very strong you can be what you can see vibe in Silicon Valley. So the more visible we can make women and underrepresented minorities who are founders, who are having success, the more people who are going to follow in their footsteps. And then lastly on profiles, I don't think that it needs to be relegated to just founders. Most of the best founders in technology have surrounded themselves with a founding team of people who are tremendously talented, who work just as hard as they do, but who share almost none of the glory. And these are folks who I would characterize as rising stars. And if there's anything that is more interesting to people than new data or new products, it's the people that they should already know about. They want to feel in the know, like, oh, I totally understand. I knew that that person was coming up before they made it big. And so I've seen a lot of these rising star stories perform very well. Utility stories, making stories that are useful. This is something that is extremely relevant to my day-to-day job. In fact, we don't publish anything on the first round review that doesn't hit a standard of offering tactical advice that can be applied immediately by a reader. And this is the reason that I think that we have been so successful, the entire reason. People are very, very interested in what can help them achieve their own goals in their personal life, in their career. So really thinking through what is the information that people need, what are the actions that they want to take, what is the advice that they really require to get to where they want to go, and then designing stories around that. Failure stories, I should probably call them vulnerability stories instead, but there's a ton of organic interest in understanding why and how companies failed, why and how products failed. If you can find founders who are willing to delve into what it was like to work so hard on something and have it not work out, there is going to be tremendous interest in that. Tech is an inherently aspirational industry. The people who are not already entrepreneurs, there's millions of them out there who want to be. And so the more you can tell relatable stories that make it clear to these folks that the people who are successful, who are building transformative tech, are human beings too, who have made a lot of sacrifices, who have taken a lot of risks, those stories tend to perform extremely well. And then the last type of story is what I call a future vision story. And I see some of this being reported, but not a ton of it. It's really taking what is happening in the industry right now, the types of companies that are coming out, the types of products that we see launching, and then extrapolating out what this means for 5, 10, 20, 50 years in the future. The future as a concept is very, very interesting to people. It touches people's lives very intimately. All of us have questions like, how am I going to get to work in 5 years? How am I going to take care of my aging parents in 15 years? What is it that is going to shape the lives of my children and their interests in 20 years? So instead of reporting just on the day-to-day business back and forth or the social or political dynamics within the industry, taking what is happening now and providing a really compelling view of the future is something that people are extremely interested in. And whenever I see stories about it, it gets tremendous audience. So in conclusion, I'd say if there's one sort of overarching thing that I've communicated, it's that the way that startups can be covered or are being covered is changing just as fast as the technology itself. And it's never been more important for startups to have their stories told. It has tremendous implications for whether they're able to hire the best candidates or get the funding that they need. So I have tremendous respect for all of you in this room who make the decisions that do impact startups in that way. And my hope is that I offered some new ideas and thoughts on how you might do that in the future. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated being here.